My name is John Peterson, and I lead the data science team for Uber Elevate, and it's wonderful to be back at the second Elevate Summit. The role of the data science team is to leverage Uber's incredibly powerful data and knowledge of how people move throughout cities so as to make informed decisions and to develop a rigorous understanding of a very dynamic and very complex space. It's an incredibly exciting time as well to be a data scientist, as industries from around the world are starting to embrace the power and ubiquity of data and algorithms unlike any time seen before. The eVTOL ecosystem is certainly no exception to that, so I am thrilled to be here to talk a little bit about our progress, some challenges, and opportunities ahead. While pressing a button and getting a flight on the Uber platform is still about a half-decade away, there are a lot of salient questions that have to be answered much sooner. Understanding which cities we want to operate in. Our head of policy just spoke about selecting a third city. Trying to understand what an initial network looks like in a city and how it evolves over time as we scale. Understanding the precise infrastructure requirements at every single site to meet our expected demand. Understanding how people and vehicles move throughout networks are fundamentally important. It also turns out that they're pretty difficult problems as well. So trying to answer these questions arbitrarily is completely off the table. Instead, in true Uber fashion, we want to rely on a principled, bottoms-up, rigorous methodology to answer these questions and many others. So kind of the atomic unit to all of these questions is the trip, an origin, a destination, a time of day. So Uber understands trip movement fairly well, but there's a lot more to it. There's understanding why people choose the way they do. And so to answer these questions and others, we've partnered with RSG, whose founder and president, Dr. Tom Adler, is here today. And so I'd like to welcome Dr. Adler up to speak a little bit about our collaboration.
Thanks, John. And I just wanted to start out by saying how excited we are to be working with the Uber Elevate team. Very exciting time in this initiative, and certainly in the industry with all of the changes that have been occurring in the transportation space over the past several years. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that we've been doing with John and his team. And the focus of our work has been estimating future demand for this new air mobility service. And what I'm going to start out by doing is noting here something that I think all of you probably understand, which is that there are a lot of challenges to developing reliable estimates of demand for a revolutionary new service like urban air mobility. And the reasons for that are a couple. One is that within a major metropolitan region like either LA or Dallas, there are tens of millions of trips, and each of them is unique in a number of respects: starting point, ending point, the purpose of the trip, the time of day, as John pointed out. All create unique circumstances and all potentially create unique value for different travelers. And so this creates a bit of a challenge. We can't model demand for this type of service in the same way that we model demand, for example, for a new smartphone or something like that, because everybody is going to be seeing a different type of service, different characteristics of service, depending on where they're coming from, going to, time of day, and so forth. So fortunately, there has been a lot of work in the field of travel demand forecasting addressing these types of challenges. And in fact, travel demand forecasting was one of the first non-military, one of the largest non-military uses of computers back in the early days of computing in the 1950s and 1960s, as a number of urban areas such as Detroit and Chicago were trying to understand how to develop transportation infrastructure in order to serve the demands and needs of their population. But of course, over the past 60 years, since the inception of this field of travel demand modeling, there's been a lot of good work to advance the field. And in fact, the approach that we developed for this application takes advantage of state-of-the-art methods and data. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time giving you a kind of brief synopsis of how we put this process together together with our partners at Uber. And so First, we began by populating simulated versions of Los Angeles and Dallas with synthetic households. Synthetic in the sense that they're not individually identical to the actual households in those regions, but rather at the census block level, which is a relatively fine geography, they collectively match the census demographics, such as household size, income, and so forth. So that's the first step. Second, we wanted to determine the types of trips that households make in these regions, and for that, we drew from a set of data that both Uber and other third-party aggregators collect that are now commercially available that describe the full set of trips that characterize each of these regions. And you saw some examples of those in some of the slides that Eric showed you yesterday during the intro sessions. We then, of course, wanted to know something about how travelers will use urban air mobility and how that fits into the trips that they're currently making or that they might make in the future. And so we also conducted an in-depth survey of current travelers in these regions, and I'll tell you more about those in a bit. And then we used those survey data to develop statistical models of travelers' mode choices, and that was, Eric referred yesterday to the travel mode choice model that was developed, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a bit. And then finally, that model was applied to all of the households and trips in each of those cities to determine how many would likely use Uber Air under a variety of different future scenarios. So that's by way of introduction to the process, and now I'll dive a little bit more deeply into each of these elements of the process. So here's a graphical depiction of the synthetic population that was constructed for LA and I'll show you in a minute Dallas as well. 4.3 million households in Los Angeles and 3.5 million in the latter. You can see on one side here the census data, which is the most current information about the actual characteristics of the population, and on the other side, the synthetic population. It matches almost identically in all of the important characteristics that population. Here's Dallas-Fort Worth. You can see similar pattern. The darker shaded areas, by the way, are the ones with a higher population, larger numbers of households. And you can see the most important thing here is see the match between the synthetic population, which are synthetic households, and the census population. And then an important step is taking those households and matching them with the trips. I mentioned that there are a large number of trips in each of these areas, tens of millions, and you again saw this in some of the slides that Eric put together yesterday. Tens of millions representing over on this first graphic here showing the Los Angeles region, almost 46 million trips in the Los Angeles region daily. 27 million trips in Dallas-Fort Worth. These are derived from third-party cellular and Uber data, and they are calibrated using a number of techniques, including looking at actual traffic counts in the region. So tens of millions of trips, each of which is unique in a number of characteristics, and each of which potentially is either in a position to gain tremendous value from urban air mobility, or in some cases, maybe they're too short, or in areas where the urban air service won't provide the service to them, where they might not have, they have much lesser value. So I said the next step was a traveler survey, and this traveler survey was designed to quantify the trade-offs that different travelers make when considering alternative transportation options for their trips. And in particular, we wanted to look both at the core service attributes, the core trade-off that people make between a trip that might be faster using Uber Air and, at least in the initial rollouts, might be more expensive, versus an alternative, for example, a completely ground trip, which is a bit slower or maybe significantly slower, but less expensive. And so we wanted to understand that core trade-off between saving time and spending more money. But we also wanted to look at some of the effects of a number of other characteristics of the trip. The access and egress, how you get to and from the Uber Air service, mode transfers that are part of that service, and then also the characteristics of the other modes that are available within the region in which a trip's being made. So we collected data that allow us to do that, and I'll tell you a little bit about how we collected those data. And then finally, we wanted also to quantify current perceptions and attitudes about eVTOL flight, understanding that this is a very new technology. Nobody in the regions will have really experienced it in any direct way. And so we understand that perceptions will change over time, but at least we wanted to capture what current perceptions and attitudes are about the technology. So let me tell you a little bit about the survey, a little bit more about the survey. We surveyed both in the Dallas-Fort Worth and Los Angeles regions, obviously. We were looking specifically for trips that were more likely to be trips for which Uber Air would provide a competitive advantage. And so we're looking at trips generally between 7 and 75 miles on the longer end, not any of those really short trips that likely wouldn't, at least in initial rollouts, benefit from the types of service that would realistically be available. And we're looking also at trips that were at least 30 minutes in duration. And as you probably are aware, that's not very hard to find in the Los Angeles and Dallas region. A lot of trips are 30 minutes or longer, and certainly a lot of trips that are being made in very heavily congested conditions, and for which Uber Air would be a very competitive alternative. So we collected data from about 2,500 respondents in total across the two areas. The survey itself was a smartphone-based survey. We had each respondent begin by describing a trip that they'd made recently, and we focused. We included all types of trips. You can see the types of trips that were being made in the region. The ones in orange are ones that we actually oversampled a bit because we understood that those are potentially trips for which Uber Air, at least in the initial rollouts, would provide some significant additional value, going to and from an airport, for example, going to an entertainment event. We also collected information about current modes of being used, obviously personal household vehicle, ride-sharing services, but also trips that are being made by taxi, bus, light rail, commuter rail, rental vehicles, all types of trips in the area. And then we collected additional travel details, trip details, including origin, destination, obviously, in a great deal of geographic detail, delays that were incurred along the way, occupancy, parking, tolls, all the details that characterize trips and the details that are important to people in making choices between alternative modes. So after we collected information about a trip that they had made that would be potentially be able to be of value in an urban air service, we also introduced them to the concept of urban air mobility, and we described the urban air concept to them both in terms of the types of vehicles that would, the types of aircraft that would be used to service them. Go back here. As well as the kind of the connectedness, the way the trip would be made from end to end, the access portion using, for example, UberX, the air portion, and then the egress condition. After we described the concept, we then presented them with a set of possible future scenarios involving the trip that they just described. So this is what we called a reference trip. But now with Uber Air as an option. And the reason for using this reference trip is because there are often a lot of unique circumstances around a trip that somebody actually makes that either make Uber Air, that would either make a new mode like Uber Air more attractive or potentially less attractive depending on those circumstances. So we presented them with a set of alternatives. Here you can see at the bottom an Uber Air alternative, and here it has involves significant time savings for this trip, about 45 minutes of time savings. These scenarios were constructed uniquely for each traveler, starting with their reference trip and then understanding what alternatives could be available to them, how Uber Air might service that trip. But we used a underlying statistically efficient conjoint experimental design, big words, but basically a design that allows us to look at how each of the individual factors, the travel times, the access times, all those factors affect how people make choices. And that kind of experimental design can support statistical estimation of the parameters of a mode choice model, which was one of the outcomes of this survey work. We also asked travelers how they felt about the concept of urban air mobility after seeing what the concept was and understanding how it might work for an example trip that they'd made. About half of the people in our sample indicated real excitement about the concept overall, but there are certainly segments who are much more excited about it. And so, for example, younger males, those who currently use ride-sharing services, differentially are significantly more excited about the service, at least in its initial years. And obviously, this will change through time after the service is actually introduced. Large majority of travelers in both of these cities view current travel conditions as essentially undesirable, I'll put it that way, and there were certainly some stronger words that were used for some of the trips in both of these areas. And then at the bottom you can see that as with any new technology, some have concerns about using this new service. About a quarter to a third said that they were uncomfortable with the thought of either flying in a small plane or flying in a small electric eVTOL aircraft. And that's not surprising. It's similar to what we see in looking at other technologies like automated vehicles, and something that presumably over time will change. So let me now kind of get to the core of this exercise. From the travel survey data, we developed a multinomial logit form mode choice model, and all that means is it's a model that relates the different features and characteristics of the new service, Uber Air, as well as the characteristics of existing services, their cars, taxis, existing ground ride-sharing services, etc., to the likelihood of somebody actually choosing each of those alternatives, in this case Uber Air, as an important new service. This model includes 65 statistically estimated parameters, a fairly big model in that sense. It describes how different travelers will respond to the modal options for their travel. And the reason for 65 parameters is there's a lot of variation in the population about how they view modal alternatives, and particularly the kind of value they derive out of a new service like Uber Air. And then there are also a lot of details about the services that exist, including the travel times and costs, but also other aspects of those services. So let me just tell you a little bit about what we found when we put all that information together, and from those 65 parameters, I'll distill it down to a few key findings here. First of all, one important thing to note is that overall, despite the fact that there are some people who obviously are a little concerned about using this type of air travel because don't have experience with it, there overall was a very strong modal preference for Uber Air over all currently available alternatives, and that's likely due to a number of things. There are certainly a lot of people who are excited about the idea of this new mode, being able to go up and fly over traffic, but there are also very significant value that a lot of people saw in the service, the significant reduction in travel time and avoiding the congested conditions. The other thing that's important to note is that, and this is probably more important in the initial rollout, where Uber Air will be priced as a premium service, that is, it'll be priced higher than existing services, is that there were fairly significant willingness to pay for travel time savings, and we call those values of time in the industry. And you can see in this chart The green line representing the base, that's the average value of time for all of the people in our sample. And you can see here that people like me, age 45 plus, we're not as willing to pay as much for a service like this. Actually, that wouldn't be me, but some people like me. But on the other hand, you can see some multipliers starting to happen. So for example, for younger people, age 18 to 24, about 25% higher willingness to pay. If you're going to or from an airport, about 30 or 40% higher willingness to pay. If you're in the LA region at all, about 40% higher willingness to pay compared to Dallas, and that's because of the conditions here in the Los Angeles region, obviously. Work commute trips, these trips that people find really difficult and where reliability is really important, about 50% higher. And then the granddaddy of them all is the LA airport trip. And presumably this is something that you all understand, people willing to pay close to 175% of what the average is for all of the trips. Let me just move on and talk about how all of this fits together. This is the forecasting model that Eric mentioned briefly and that John's going to describe a little bit more. Just one note about this forecasting model, the Uber team put this model together in a matter of weeks, a process that would in other areas of the country and in other applications might take months or years to do. So kudos to that team for pulling together. The way that the model's structured is it begins with the synthetic population that I mentioned before, there's software that's been developed called PopSim that does this type of population synthesis, develops the 4 million households, for example, for the LA area. Trip origin and destination data were linked to the synthetic population, so now we have all of these households, all of them making unique trips, and then the mode choice model is applied to those trips to determine the likelihood of using Uber to Air. As I mentioned, this is a logit form called a discrete choice model. It includes covariates to control for region, demographics, trip purpose, etc. So that's the overall structure of the model, and now, John, you're going to talk a little bit about how it was used, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. And I want to say on behalf of the Elevate team, I want to express an appreciation to you and your colleagues from RSG, including Mark Fowler, Alex Richard, and Maren Outwater, all of whom are in this room. You were tremendous partners throughout and still are. I also want to thank my colleague, Juryen Gu, for working very closely with RSG in applying this model. Your all-nighters are nothing short of inspirational. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how we can use this powerful data to make informed decisions. So, pardon me. Okay, so I stated some open questions when I did my introduction. We want to understand how many riders we can actually serve. We want to understand how networks actually develop over time. And this is not an exhaustive set of questions by any means, but the core is all of these questions rely on a network consisting of nodes. Formally, when I say node, I'm speaking of a fairly abstract term. It's a latitude-longitude whose exact infrastructure specifications are not necessarily known at this time. It could be a single skyport. It could be a distributed set of skyports. The key thing is a node is a location for right now. And we're going to play a little game, okay? We're going to go to the Los Angeles area, and we're going to try to select the best 10 nodes in greater LA such that we can induce the highest number of trips, okay? So this is a game. An exercise, we're going to walk through this together. So we announced yesterday that on a typical day in Los Angeles, there are about 45.8 million trips. And this is a graph, by the way, that you've seen several times now. The heights of these bars correspond to trip volumes into and out of these regions. And these grid points are 1 square kilometer areas, okay? So the taller the bar, the busier activity throughout the day. And so the game we're going to play is select 10 nodes to induce demand. Okay, so if you study this graph as carefully as my team and I have, you will note that there's kind of an upside-down U that span from downtown to LAX. They include other areas like West Hollywood, Santa Monica. So we have this kind of upside-down U here, pardon me. Okay, so it's only natural that we want a sufficient presence in that upside-down U, right? So it gives us the first 5 nodes. We have 5 down, maybe 5 more to go. So it's perfectly reasonable to take the remainder of the map and kind of one by one just place these nodes into areas that have high bars. Okay, so we wound up with this network right here. So we include additional nodes south of downtown, kind of near the USC campus. We have North Hollywood, so that's a little bit north of downtown. Irvine is represented in the southernmost node you see. Burbank, also a little bit northeast of downtown. And then South Pasadena, which is the easternmost node. Okay, so this is a solution. This is, I think, a perfectly reasonable assertion to make that this network would constitute the highest throughput. It turns out this is actually a pretty lousy solution, by the way. I say it's lousy because we have tools that can evaluate this, and there's a significant gap in the riders we can serve between this network and one that we believe to be optimum. And I think there are 3 reasons why that is. First of all, this network induces many short trips. So not surprisingly, that upside-down U, there's a lot of density. There's a high density of nodes in that area. And so if you think about this as a kind of a fully connected graph, you will see many of these arcs have short distances. Now let me assert that we very much aspire to live in a world where we can serve some of these trips in some day. But it's a little bit difficult when you think about multimodality. You have to get riders to and from these nodes, right? And so the savings that's borne out in the air is largely offset by things like Tom spoke about, your first mile, last mile, going up in an elevator. And so that's not really captured here. Now again, it doesn't mean you can't capture some short trips, but you have to be very selective, and you have to know far more data than just this kind of aggregated representation. Instead, you really need to know, so it seems, I guess what I want to say is it seems like if you want to cover short distance trips, they have to be somewhat walkable, right? And there's no way of knowing if these trips are walkable. So what we have here is we've got data. This is a sample of 500 trips on the Uber platform corresponding to 2 of these nodes who will remain anonymous. And they tell a very different story. The graph on the top shows a wide dispersion of pickups and drop-offs, whereas on the bottom, while there is some dispersion, it's more tightly concentrated. So all else being equal, knowing nothing else, it seems plausible that if you want to focus on short trips, that all else equal, the bottom is going to be a little bit easier to serve than the top. So the first problem was we have short trips. They're very difficult to cover, particularly if you have 10 nodes, right? Because there's an opportunity cost. You could saturate that area, but that means you can't cover other areas. Second, I haven't said anything about the time of the trip. That's incredibly important here. What we have is just aggregated data over a single day, right? But time actually matters. And so again, I'm taking 2 nodes again, and we're going to look at the patterns corresponding to inbound and outbound trips from 2 of these nodes. The graph on the top shows a significant imbalance with respect to the trips that are incoming and outcoming. Now, just because there's an imbalance does not necessarily make that node undesirable. If there's ways to pool riders together, then suddenly that imbalance is not nearly as an adverse impact on your throughput potential. But there are operational risks. If there's significant imbalance, especially, the potential risk is either vehicles potentially have to remain on the ground, being underutilized, or potentially deadhead, fly empty to accommodate demand elsewhere. So that's very difficult, whereas the node represented in the bottom graph has considerably more parity. The inbounds and outbounds are very similar throughout the day. So again, knowing nothing else, the bottom plot seems to be slightly more favorable. But without knowing the exact time of the trips, as well as the exact precise latitude, longitude of your pickups and drop-offs, it's really hard to make any inferences. Finally, we haven't said anything about kind of the origin-destination flows between them. So we have 2 heat maps here, and this is fairly anonymized data, by the way, but these heat maps represent total activity in the LA area that is relative to a reference point. So the graph on the left shows a reference point corresponding to Santa Monica. So you can see all of the overwhelming majority of trips that can potentially be served are going to be kind of in and around the Santa Monica area along the coast. Whereas the picture on the right, the reference point is downtown. Again, not knowing the precise origins and destinations of each one of these nodes, it's not sufficient to tell us what our true throughput potential can be. It's all else equal, easier to serve trips from the right, from downtown to that high demand area than it is on the plot on the left. So what we need is we need far more data than just looking at aggregated trip counts over a day, right? We need a spatio-temporal representation of how trips evolve throughout the day and across different regions. And so I'm going to play another video for you. And anyone that was in the keynote yesterday saw a version very similar to this. But we're going to play a day in Los Angeles. And it's going to correspond to 18 hours, which we believe will be a mission day. And again, heights correspond to total activities. But now we're going to color code whether these trips are inbound or outbound. So red indicates you have more trips inbound, blue, more outbound. So people in LA are waking up. You can tell the commute time is right around now as we have downtown, very high bars, going right into downtown. Lunchtime is very interesting. You have high bars, but there's kind of a lot of whiteness. People are moving everywhere, in and out, and people are starting to go home right now, and LA is getting ready to go to bed. I feel like I could make a great political commentator on CNN on election night. So we need a new approach. Just looking at raw data is not enough. We have to get much more specific. So what we want to do is we want to model every single trip by their origin, their destination, and time of day. Okay, this is a very different approach from this kind of pin the tail on the donkey that we just played a minute ago. So in order to discuss this modeling paradigm, we have to talk exactly what we mean by an itinerary. A lot of times we mention that Uber Air is a service where you press a button and get a flight, but it's a lot more difficult than that. You have to get people to and from these skyports. Individuals have to go through security. There's a lot more than just the flight portion. So these shots are taken from the Vision video that we published last year, where we have a protagonist who's trying to get home for dinner by 5:45. The individual opens the app, she enters her destination, and in the back end, there's a lot of complexity. We are searching for skyports that are fairly near her origin and destination. If there exists a pair that are close by where we can string together an itinerary, the individual will see Uber Air as an option. We also have to marshal the individual to one of these skyports. This could be done in an Uber. It could be done by bicycling. It could be done by walking. In this instance, our protagonist is close to the departure skyport for which she walks, enters the building, goes up the elevator. She goes to the top where the Uber skyport is at the roof. She enters security, exits security, and is entering her flight phase. The arrival is at another skyport, an arrival skyport, which in this case is on the top of a transit building, where an Uber is waiting for her upon arrival, and she gets home just in time for dinner. The eyes well up every time. There's a lot of complexity here. I'm not going to go into some of these decisions about how vehicles are dispatched, or we haven't really talked about that. There will be many future sessions in Elevate Summits in the future, I promise you. But the whole point is we have to capture each one of these attributes when we want to model how we're selecting these nodes. It's very important. So we're going to take an example here. This is a trip that actually occurred on the Uber platform. It is from Manhattan Beach, which is the pickup is represented in the green. It goes to near downtown, which just happens to be Dodger Stadium. This trip, by the way, was not arbitrarily chosen. It just so happens that it was a day where the Giants shut out the Dodgers. Sorry, Dodgers fans. But this trip took 80 minutes. And when you actually drill in and you actually look at this trip, there's a lot of red on the map. Even by Los Angeles standards, this was a pretty lousy experience in terms of the trip volume, congestion. This was problematic. In other words, this is perfect for an Uber Air service. Okay, so what I'd like to do is I would like to see what an Uber Air trip may have looked like, okay? So again, the multimodality is the individual leaves Manhattan Beach, travels in an Uber or by bicycling or by walking to a departure skyport. That is seen by the green open circle. The air segment is pretty apparent here. The arrival is near Dodger Stadium, where the individual is transported just in time for the first pitch. But there might have been other skyports as well. In this case, there's a skyport that's just north and east of the original one. By all accounts, that's a perfectly reasonable place to send the passenger to take another flight, right? It so turns out that on their first segment, by the way, the ground times of both the origin and destination were about 6 minutes each, and the air portion of the segment was a little over 9 minutes, and that captures everything. That captures the hover mode, that captures time for transition, the cruise speed at 150 miles per hour, everything. The time savings is substantial. It's around 50 minutes. So now let's consider if we would have sent this individual to another skyport, a little bit farther away. It so turns out that it was about 9 minutes further. Still induces high time savings, still a pretty attractive option relative to the incumbent mode, in my opinion. But all else being equal, this individual is far less likely to convert to Uber Air. And this is the power of the demand model, by the way, that Tom spoke about. We know that if we send the individual to a further away skyport, it's undesirable relative to the best option. But how much so, it was an open question. Now we have the ability to leverage this really powerful demand model. We can actually quantify the relative difference in these two trips. And what we find is a 25% reduction in the likelihood that that individual actually opts for Uber Air. That's really powerful. And there's another benefit of this demand model as well. Previously, our initial thinking was that if we were going to assign an individual to an AIR itinerary, that there had to have been some sufficient time savings, maybe 40%, maybe 30%. This was a number that was never really substantiated. It's hard to know the unknown. It's hard to model the unknown. So what the demand model does, it allows us to capture something far more intelligently because it considers individuals that move across different origins and destination pairs at different times of day. That's really powerful. Okay, so we can talk about, so we've talked a little bit about what an itinerary is. We've talked about some of the considerations that go into our modeling. Now, how do we link itineraries? Remember the game we were playing? We're going to find 10 nodes. So now I'm going to link the two together. So in the previous illustration, we had two possible itineraries for which to send someone on an Uber Air, right? There was Skyport 1, which is closer, and Skyport 2, slightly farther away. It's plausible to think there are going to be more than one Skyport in downtown, but in this instance, just for illustration, there's only one, giving two itineraries. Again, what we're going to do is we're going to select. Our problem is to find 10 nodes, right? We haven't selected any nodes here. These are just possible areas. These could be real estate that we may be evaluating. They could be arbitrary points. It doesn't matter. But we have to select the best 10 nodes. So one option is, if we're fortunate and we can actually select one of those two departure nodes, as well as that downtown node, this individual is eligible to take Uber Air. However, if we don't select one, so in this case we select the downtown node, but we do not select the departure node, then this individual cannot take Uber Air. And it's only the Dodgers, so I think it's, perhaps it's not as big of a penalty. So this is just an exercise to show how we're linking, how we're selecting nodes with how we're inducing itineraries. And that was just for one trip. But that individual wasn't the only person traveling on that particular day between those two areas. There were far more trips just in the evening alone on this particular day. So the blue nodes correspond to somewhat similar pickups, and the orange are drop-offs. So you can imagine how this problem grows in complexity when we factor in far more trips that are nearby. But there's nothing particularly special about this corridor. Think about all of Los Angeles, 45.8 million trips. Here are all pickups and drop-offs in a given day. Think about the complexity there. This is a representation of all the trips in LA. So again, we have to find the best 10, considering how we're building itineraries for every single ride in this network. And so by now, many of you have heard about this Flux Optimizer. It was mentioned in Eric Allison's keynote yesterday, and some of you that may have drawn a short straw may have heard me speak about this in Dallas last year. This is a network optimization tool that leverages Uber data and now demand modeling in order to make informed decisions. And so we have a way to solve for this problem. One thing that we can do is we can kind of blanket the LA area with these white dots. Now these white dots are generated through a clustering algorithm. And now the problem is let's select 10 nodes, okay? And so one of the points I tried to make a couple slides ago is that the exact location matters. It's not enough to say we want to build a skyport in West Hollywood, but the throughput potential of where in West Hollywood can be considerable, and that's what makes this problem so difficult. So we've got 1,500 cluster points. We want to choose 10. It's a pretty simple exercise in combinatorics, but nevertheless, it just makes kind of for a cool presentation. So the number of combinations are many. And our Flux Optimizer is a proprietary algorithm that leverages machine learning and optimization to ultimately produce a network, something like what you see here. So this is a We've kind of obfuscated some of the locations, but it's fairly representative of what a network looks like. And you'll see that unlike the pin the tail on the donkey game, we have a far wider dispersion of where these nodes that we're selecting. And this is a network that can induce the highest throughput. So I know Mark Moore's not in this room because I haven't used the word eVTOL for a while. If he were in the room, I'd be wearing tomatoes right now. So the question so it's far more complex than anything we've stated, because we have not really considered other riders and matching them, and we haven't really considered vehicles. So the network optimization model gives us ultimately a network, and the network consists of, again, nodes and flight arcs that connect those nodes. So it may be hard to see, but we've got 4 nodes here. We've got 2 near Manhattan Beach, and we've got 2 near the downtown area. And in a perfect world, all else equal, we want to send our rider, we want to deliver a magical experience for the rider, we send him or her to the nearest nodes, right? This is a good experience. This is something, when I talk about first principles, delivering delightful experiences, it is absolutely essential to us and to our initiative. However, it's not as simple as that, right? There might be another node for which there are 3 other riders. Remember, this is a shared ride service. We're trying to pool this individual with others. And if there is a world in which there's another nearby node that's maybe just slightly farther, and there are other people for whom are going to roughly the same destination, we may want to think about this very delicate balance between rider experience and system efficiency. And this is what makes the routing aspect so incredibly difficult, because there are trade-offs everywhere, and we're going to see a few of them. So one of the trade-offs we mentioned is going slightly farther away to match with more riders. But by the way, it's more difficult than this. Just because you have riders that are going kind of to and from the same area, we haven't stated anything about time, right? Time is another great complexity here. So what we have here is just a simple representation of exactly this network. It's called a time-space network. So we have 2 nodes represented, the origin node and the destination node. Green dots match to green dots, red to red. But we also throw in time. So if there's a world where all 4 of these riders arrive at that departure node 3 minutes apart, this leads to a pretty obvious solution. Batch them together, everyone wins. You're giving the riders a pleasant experience, and you are driving efficiency. But it's not always likely to be that easy. What if there was a 17-minute gap between the first arrival and the last? What do you do then? On one hand, batching together still can induce very large time savings, even for that person that arrives at that node first. But that's not necessarily a magical experience. And that's one of the fundamental trade-offs that we're assessing. So it's perfectly reasonable to think that we would actually kind of make these 4 people and put them into 2 batches. They'll each have their own VTOL. But I haven't even said anything about VTOLs yet either. Manhattan Beach may or may not have many VTOLs at any given point in time. If this is at scale, and there are many nodes throughout the network, Manhattan Beach might be competing with other nodes with respect to VTOL resources. So what happens if a VTOL arrives after the arrival of someone to that skyport? Again, do you delay? Do you have them wait on the ground longer and dispatch them, or not? So maybe what you do is you send the riders to an alternate node. I mean, there's just a lot of complexity here. I haven't said anything about batteries either. So here we've got that same representation. We've got these same 4 individuals. We've got 2 of them go to one departure node, 2 of them go to the other one. So the second vehicle that is depicted on the right, this is a vehicle, this blue arc is a VTOL arc. The vehicle arrives well in advance of its subsequent departure, giving it plenty of time on the ground to recharge for its next mission. However, vehicle 1, it arrives immediately prior to the arrival of the two individuals to that node. There may not be sufficient recharging time to complete its next mission. Even if there was sufficient time on the ground to recharge for its next mission, you may need to intentionally hold it on the ground longer. What if it's 3:50 p.m. and you've got rush hour in LA approaching very shortly? So you have to factor in matching riders, you have to route vehicles, and then you have to think about when, where, and how much to recharge on the ground. This is an extraordinarily difficult problem. And just to give an example of how this Flux Optimizer can be used, there are a number of use cases, but one of the things that we do is we have worked with our vehicles team to consult and influence some of the design characteristics of the vehicles. And these are things like payload and speed, we work with our head of operations to evaluate ground operations, for instance, and various sensitivities in the system. And so one of the things that we can study is, let's take a network and let's optimize it for a 150 mile per hour vehicle at cruise and one that is 120 miles per hour at cruise. It turns out you get very different networks. If you look at this, again, this is the graph on the left shows the 10-node solution that we've seen previously. And the graph on the right is its solution, but the vehicle's traveling 30 miles per hour slower. It turns out 8 of the nodes actually do match, and then 2 of them get kind of removed farther. So what we do is we take 2 of the nodes a little bit near downtown, and they get moved a little bit more on the periphery. And the reason, the intuition is very simple. A slower vehicle means that you have to fly longer distance to make up for lost time associated with first mile, last mile, ingress, and egress. So your networks look different. Not only does your networks look different, but ultimately the number of riders you can serve is greatly lower. So we get an almost 20% reduction in our total throughput in this particular example. So this Flux Optimizer, again, this is a tool, and I just wanted to take a peek underneath the hood of the system that was mentioned in our keynote yesterday. We talked a little bit about some of the use cases and how this is a really hard problem. This is a tool that our team has built up that determines, again, optimal networks. It's used we can do things like evaluate real estate portfolios in different cities. We can evaluate cities. We can determine when, where, how much to recharge, inform vehicle designs where applicable. This is a tool that we have used this past year to do things like many of these questions that I just mentioned. And this is something that we still invest in very heavily. So we're grateful for the work RSG's done and our internal data science team as well. We want to make further improvements to our demand model. We mentioned yesterday the importance of latent demand. We have a very strong belief that there's going to be a lot of demand induced by this service. So demand from Uber Air can be a shift in modes, or it could be new trips that happen that would not have happened otherwise. So this is an area that we are incredibly interested in working very diligently on. There are also a lot of other features we can do. One of the interesting things is what do we do if we consider variable recharging times on the ground instead of static ones? What about noise? So what we see on the right here is an interesting study that we put together very recently where we can evaluate different routes. So once we have networks, we can look at routes. We can characterize performance on different routes. We can look at the deltas between the time, the energy required, and some attributes about noise. You can do things like qualitative noise studies, understanding how many people you may be flying over on a given flight path, for instance. The real magic is when this is leveraged with ambient noise to understand what the net effects are, but even qualitative studies can be useful. So there's nothing I despise more than coming to conferences where the data science guy or woman is claiming to solve world peace through an algorithm. Instead, I think it makes sense to hear from one of our users, Swaintek, who heads our operations team. And Stan's going to talk a little bit about how this is enabling his team.
I'm going to talk a very little bit about this because I've got to be on another stage here in a couple minutes. But we'll drill this down really concisely into the fact that the ops team is in a really advantaged position within Uber Elevate right now, because not only because we have access to the data that these gentlemen just talked about, but because we have the ability to process that data and turn it into really actionable information for us to make more informed decisions. And as the primary user of the Flux Optimizer tool, we interact with JP and his team in 2 ways, really, at the ends of the process. At the beginning, where we're defining the operating specifications that go into the tool to make sure that the numbers that are being crunched kind of reflect reality, and then we consume that output. And again, at a high level, what this is it allows us to understand where the demand clusters are, but more specifically for us, what the throughput at any given moment at those nodes are, which informs what we have to design the infrastructure to build. Now, as JP talked about, there's a lot of sensitivity with the exact siting of the locations within the nodes, and what the output of this tool is a specific location. It's a lat long. But that lat long doesn't always center punch a building that can structurally support 20 aircraft on top of it. So we have to translate that into reality, And we have to start working with utilities to understand the power availability. We have to work with real estate developers to understand whether or not there are buildings that can be developed or modified to support the skyport that needs to go there to provide the throughput that needs to be provided. And whether or not the existing soundscape is such that it can cover the sound that's going to be induced in the environment. So there's a lot of trade-offs there, and we're very seldom do we get perfectly aligned with the lat long that Flux puts out. But what the follow-on analysis allows us to do is really trade-off analysis, which is all about understanding those given constraints at a system level of interaction. What is the effect on throughput if we pick site A versus site B within proximity to that node? That allows us to test alternatives and really, as we move forward, really sequence the build-out of the network, because that 5-node network that's optimized for throughput with 5 nodes and maybe 50 vehicles may not be the right foundation for the 30 or the 40-node network that we want to build out over time. So this is all really important for us to understand today, because there are really long lead times with respect to infrastructure development and grid modifications that will be required to support these skyport sites. And we are identifying the locations where we need to invest today so that we can be ready to operate in 2023 when the vehicles and the rest of the technology is online. So with that, I'm done. I think, JP, I don't know if you have time for questions, but I've got to run out of here. So thank you.
I think we originally were aiming for a 5-minute Q&A. I don't know if that's valid. I see one hand. We can take one question. Do we have time?
Security on roadways at the moment. So how could you look to an elevated sky platform when critical safety and cultural disparity between rules and regulations of the road are not verified or incorporated into the app in your major cities or small cities? There's in consideration for emergency services, communication networks, radio, certified protocols,
Sure.
Airspace.
And just for the intro, I'm so sorry. Could you please
Oh,
repeat the first part of that? Sorry.
Sure. My name is Sloan Trugman. I have a strategy and analysis firm called Eminent Insights and a data organization called Updated. I've done a comprehensive analysis of behind the wheel and the vehicle platform, where we found, and also working with transportation agencies, extreme disparities between roadway regulation, signals intelligence, and current roadway rules that are not incorporated into the app to optimize for faster routes. So if this type of system of thinking is inside of the vehicle operation across all of your existing networks, if you're looking at a flying network, how are you going to be solving for these really critical things on your roadways and just skip to airways? There's just a lot of cultural things in between.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's going to be difficult to solve.
If it's not DOT and road rules on the vehicles, then how could it be comms and airspace and protocols for emergency and police networks in your skyways? Thanks.
Sure. So this team is working very collaboratively across the Elevate teams, from policy. More broadly, our Elevate team is very much deeply embedded with other regulatory bodies to answer these questions. The answer is very complex. What I'm going to say is that this is an approach that's taken very collaboratively from the bottoms up to answer some of these questions. And there are a lot of policy implications that we're working very diligently through at the moment. Thank you.